Hey guys, and welcome to a presentation on the joints. This one should be a fairly short one. There's not much to revise. So first of all, we'll have a look at joint types. So there's three main types. One is fibrous, and that means the bones are joined by a fibrous tissue. And that means that it's held together really tightly and then there's no movement that's possible. So for example, the bones of the skull, you've got tiny little fracture lines in your skull and they're connected by fibers. But you don't want your skull to move, obviously, that could cause your brain damage. So they keep together nice and tight, and part of the reason that they were there in the first place was when you were born. Obviously your skull had to collapse slightly so it could fit through your mother's hips, and then they reform back together in the proper shape once you begin to grow. So they don't need to move anymore once you've been born, so they stay still by those fibers connecting them. Second of all is cartilaginous, and they're bones joined by cartilage, and they allow a small amount of movement. For example, the ribs attaching to the sternum, you want to be able to breathe, you need that flexibility. So you need some movement in there, but you don't need to have a full range of movement in those joints. And finally, the most popular sort of joint in the body is synovial, and that means that they've actually got a cavity in the joint, and that's filled by synovial fluid, and it allows for a lot of free movement. So your arms, your legs, hands, fingers, toes, they're all synovial joints. So within the synovial joints, there's different structures, and that's because different parts of the body have different ranges of movement. So for example, your fingers will only move up and down, whereas your shoulder can rotate nearly 360 degrees. So there's 6 types of synovial joints. You've got ball and socket, hinge, gliding, saddle, pivot, and condyloid. And I think it says in your textbooks ovoid. So ball and socket is the easiest joint to remember. It's like the ball on the head of a bone, and it sits inside its own little socket. So an example of that is the hip or the shoulder, and it's capable of motion almost in every direction. Not quite every direction, because obviously you've got parts of the body blocking it, but nearly 360 degrees. The next one is hinge. That's also a fairly popular joint. You can think about your knee and your elbow. You've only got motion in one plane or one direction, but that's to keep that joint really stable. Another example could be also between the phalanges in your fingers and your toes. Gliding is a joint where the bones actually glide over each other. So they don't really sit inside each other, they sort of move against each other. A fantastic example of this is the spine, the vertebrae in the spine, they glide over each other. They don't curve around in any particular direction. Another simple example of this would also be the carpals in the wrist. The saddle joint is where you've got the two different surfaces sitting inside each other, so concave and convex. So if you were to clasp one hand inside the other, you've got a concave surface and a convex surface, so they're curving within each other. So an example of that would be the hand, the carpo-metacarpal, so in between the carpals and the metacarpals, or the sternoclavicular joint, which is in between the sternum and the clavicle. Now the pivot joint allows for rotation internally or externally. So one example is your head sitting on your spine. You can turn your head from left to right, or you can turn in your arm, your elbow can turn left to right also, but that ends up with your palm facing upwards, which is supination, or your palm facing downwards, which is pronation. Condyloid or ovoid, that's got like a oval sort of shape in the joint itself, and that's sort of, it's not a very popular joint, but it's found in the fingers and the toes in between the carpals or the tarsals, where they join to the phalanges, so metacarpophalangeal or metatarsophalangeal. So a typical synovial joint, so right now we're having a look at the knee, and the thing that makes it the synovial joint, again, like I said, is the synovial fluid in the cavity. So you can see there that there is the tendon on the outside. So I'm looking up at the top right of the picture. Then you've got the patella, so the actual kneecap itself. There are some little fluids-filled sacs in there called bursa, and they allow for impact and to avoid friction. The meniscus is just a fancy word for the cartilage that helps separate the joint. You've also got articular cartilage there, which protects the ends of the bones. The cruciate ligament, now the cruciate ligament is the ligament that wraps from the front and back. So this is the one that the footy players will damage often if they twist their knee wrong, if they land on it. So you've got the anterior cruciate ligament and the posterior cruciate ligament, and they hold the knee together quite tightly and keep it supported. You've also got a synovial membrane. Now the synovial membrane is a very thin piece of tissue that holds all the synovial fluid in. So in between all of the joint there, you can see a white area. So not of the femur and the tibia, but in between those two themselves. That's all filled with fluid. And the reason for that being is that you don't want bone rubbing on bone, because that will wear them away quite quickly. So the synovial fluid provides lubrication. It reduces the friction. Unfortunately, sometimes we have less lubrication in our joints than we'd like. So that's when the problems start to occur in either sports injuries or when people start getting older. There's also one other word there that I left out, which is the capsule, and that's just sort of a membrane also that encapsulates everything and it keeps everything in together, which is vital because you need also some extra support, especially you can see that it wraps around the patella as well, so it holds it in place. Also with the synovial fluid, then you've got nowhere else it should be. So it's only in those synovial joints. You won't find it in the fibrous joints or the cartilaginous joints. So only the synovial joints. Now this picture I thought was a fantastic summary. It's got 6 different regions where you can find just in the arm alone 6 different joints. You've got obviously the ball and socket at the shoulder, and then all the rest that follows on. So if you think that might be useful to you, I'll post that picture on Weebly, but I also found it on Google.